In the second week of March 1471, King Edward IV took ship in Flanders, having with him Lord Hastings and Lord Say, 900 Englishmen and 300 Flemings with handguns, and sailed towards England, intending to land in Norfolk. But one of the Earl of Oxford's brothers, with the commons of the county, arose up together and put the king to sea again, and after that Edward was so troubled at sea he was forced to land in Yorkshire at Ravenspur, and there arose against him the whole country of Holderness. This extract, taken from Warkworth's Chronicle, describes the return of Edward IV from exile, the king having been banished months earlier, with his Lancastrian enemy, Henry VI, restored temporarily to the throne. The extract details perfectly the divisions that continued to tear England apart. A decade earlier, Edward, a young, strapping man of 18 years of age, led the Yorkists to a brutal victory at the Battle of Towton, which led to him becoming the new King of England in place of the Henry VI, who was forced into exile in Scotland, along with his queen and son. The new king met with considerable enthusiasm, as Edward clearly looked far more like a king than Henry VI had ever done, and with Henry suffering from mental illness, for many contemporaries, a change of regime was certainly in the best interests of the country. Edward's great triumph at Towton was owed in no small part to the support of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who had been a key figure in Edward's life since childhood, with Warwick described as being a father figure to Edward. So influential had Warwick been in Edward's path to the throne that he is more easily recognised now as Warwick the Kingmaker. However, there would later be a serious fracturing in relations between the two, as Warwick helped depose the king that he had made. Although Warwick was undoubtedly a father figure to Edward for much of his life, it had been Edward's actual father who had begun the Yorkist push for the throne. After England's final capitulation in the Hundred Years' War, there was a great deal of discontent at the reign of Henry VI, and over time it became clear to men like Richard Duke of York, despite initial pretences of loyalty to the king, that Henry was not fit to rule. The escalating conflict that followed is of course known as the Wars of the Roses. Richard himself was killed in late December 1460 as the Lancastrians defeated their Yorkist rivals at Wakefield. But just 3 months later, Richard's son, Edward, Earl of March, proved his prodigious military skill at Towton. Edward IV, if you remained on his good side, was an affable and charming young king, although he did have a most ferocious temper. Standing at 6'4", he remains England's tallest ever monarch, and with a liking for fine clothes, he would have cut a most impressive of regal figures. Although Edward certainly did have a more forceful personality than Henry VI, which wasn't difficult, it was clear to those at the time that there was another very powerful figure in the country aside from the new king. That was the Earl of Warwick. The following extract was published in a London newsletter published in July 1461. They say that every day favours the Earl of Warwick, who seems to me to be everything in this kingdom, and as if anything he lacks, he has made his brother George the Lord Chancellor of England. It was perfectly natural for Edward to place his faith in Warwick, but it certainly didn't go unnoticed about how much the Earl benefited from Edward's claiming of the crown. One chronicler asserted that there was no other man in England who had half the wealth of Warwick, but the Earl continued to be thirsty for more and more power. In 1469, Warwick married his daughter Isabel to Edward's brother, the troublesome George, Duke of Clarence, without the king's knowledge or permission. Edward was absolutely furious at Warwick's presumption, and their relationship, already strained, was damaged irreparably. 5 years earlier, Warwick had been sent to France to negotiate a marriage on behalf of Edward, who remained without a queen. Naturally, negotiating a marriage for a King of England to a foreign princess was a great honour and due recognition of Warwick's might and status. However, there would be a nasty surprise in store for Warwick. On his return to England, he discovered that Edward had secretly married a young widow, Elizabeth Woodville, who had caught his eye. Insulted and embarrassed that he had wasted his time on the continent, Warwick certainly harboured resentment against the king, resentment that never fully went away. It seems a natural conclusion to make that Isabel's secret marriage to George was a rather pointed statement aimed at the king on behalf of Warwick. What it also showed was the Earl was far too powerful and mighty. Warwick and Edward IV were now on a collision course, and in 1470 the Earl finally turned against the king for good by allying himself, shockingly, with Margaret of Anjou, the queen of the forlorn Henry VI. This alliance required much swallowing of pride, as Margaret and Warwick despised each other, but they now had a common goal: oust Edward IV from the throne that Warwick had set him upon. And the alliance, for a brief period, was successful, with Edward having to flee for his life. But on his return to England in the middle of March 1471, Edward, despite strong opposition, would win back his crown, and his final standoff against Warwick came at Barnet, where the king proved that Warwick was not the invincible force he may well have thought himself to be. Edward was again victorious, and Warwick was killed attempting to flee the battlefield. Edward's total triumph over his enemies was complete not long after, with another victory in battle at Tewkesbury, before Henry VI was murdered at the Tower of London in May of that same year. The rise of Edward IV owed much to the support of Warwick the Kingmaker, but as these events had shown, it wasn't the only factor. Edward IV was a very capable man in military terms, and indeed is one of the great commanders in English history. Warwick, having contributed to Edward's education, found that out to his cost.